Thank you. We now come to the general debate on World Immunisation Week. I call the Secretary of State, Rory Stewart, to move. Secretary of State.
Well, thank you very, very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an enormous privilege and pleasure to be standing here for the first time as the Secretary of State. But it's also a deeper pleasure to be here talking about immunisation. Because immunisation is actually an extraordinary story which is a way of illustrating both why international development really matters and also how complicated it can be in public policy terms to pull off, and how important it is to be able to communicate to the public and others how, in the end, that child dying, the terrible, terrible loss of a child from polio, can be connected right the way back to scientific research, to businesses, to international cooperation, and to very, very brave doctors and health workers on the ground. Please.
The Chamber to warmly welcome him to his new post. It's a delight sometimes to see a square peg in a square hole, if that doesn't sound rude somehow or other. But anyway, I really warmly congratulate him on his new job. Isn't one of the elements, though, that one of the most disturbing elements in recent years, that there are politicians around the world in some of the most advanced societies who preach an anti-immunisation message, and that is going to lead to the unnecessary death of children?
Absolutely. It is grossly irresponsible, and I'm afraid profoundly, disturbingly misleading, and even, I would say, ignorant to go around doing this, because I think what it ends up doing is stoking public paranoia and fear and leading to the unnecessary loss of lives. And the story of immunisation from the beginning, and indeed the story of international development from the beginning, has often been about challenging public perceptions, challenging irrational fears and following through. And there's reasons for this. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we go to the heart of what immunisation is, it carries within it the seeds of that challenge. The basic idea of immunisation is, of course, that you make somebody sick to make them better. And that has, from the very beginning, involved challenging public fears, and it's also involved doing something which governments find quite difficult to do, which is to take risk and work genuinely collaboratively internationally. So immunisation was, of course, although we tend to pat ourselves on the back a great deal in this country, not a European discovery at all. It was a Chinese discovery of the early 16th century in China, and when Chinese public health officials, or their equivalents in the early 16th century, did this, they began by going into villages and sneezing into people's mouths. By doing so, they reduced the mortality rate 10 or 20-fold, very, very rapidly. But remember, reducing the mortality rate 10 or 20-fold still meant that although the normal mortality rate for smallpox was 20 to 30%, under this new technique, it was still a mortality rate of between 0.5 and 2%. So it was a very, very risky procedure. This immunisation practice moved to Britain. I'm going to move on with this international point, and arrived with us in about 1700. And I'm going to give way to the Honourable Learned Doctor now.
Thank you very much, and I too would welcome the Secretary of State and congratulate him on his new post. It was actually a bit more dramatic in that variolation actually involved cutting into veins and putting scabs from smallpox, which did indeed make people ill, and then they were immune. But modern vaccines do not do that. They are no longer based on making someone ill. You know, people have this fallacy that the flu vaccine will give you flu. It does not. So modern vaccination is no longer based on giving you an illness to protect you from worse.
So if we can move very rapidly forward, is the key to this, which is the key of scientific advances, where these things become safer all the time. So from China to Britain, and in Britain, in 1799, the development of vaccination, in other words, the use of cows in order to do this, and then the developments of Louis Pasteur in the 1880s in France, and then, of course, the amazing developments in the post-war period. But throughout all of this, what you see is something that really matters. For DFID, right, Department for International Development, is a department that cooperates with other countries, that puts science at its heart, And this story, which links China to Britain, Britain to France, France to the United States in its early history, is the history that continues today with Gavi, which is the Global Alliance. In all of this work, the same themes are occurring at an accelerated rate. So we have achieved the eradication, really remarkable eradication of smallpox. We are close to a 99% success rate on wild polio. But it is in Ebola that you can see today the security risks, the scientific advances, the complexity and the international cooperation most clearly. In 2015, 2016, this department, working with other international partners, began to develop initially in Guinea and then through partnerships, academic partnerships, the United States and Canada, the first attempts at inoculation against Ebola. Now, this deals with a disease which, like all these diseases, finds no borders, which has a direct contact with justifying the international aid budget here in the United Kingdom. Right? Perhaps the most easy way of explaining to people why we do these things, why we have an international development budget, is that had that disease taken off in Liberia and Sierra Leone, with modern transport mechanisms, very rapidly, that disease would have found its way to Europe and ultimately to the United Kingdom, and people would have been dying here. That investment, which seems quite complex, and often involves, particularly if you're dealing with something like wild polio, spending a surprising amount of money tracking down the last few cases, is the kind of investment only a government can do, and only an international aid budget can do. Why? Because it's not a normal economic case. If you were to ask the individual whether they wanted to spend a lot of money inoculating themselves, they might say no. And if you looked at it in a traditional cost-benefit analysis, you might conclude, for the point of view of that individual, why are you spending so much money? But the point is that individual is part of a community. That community is part of a broader nation. And if that disease takes off, it begins to infect hundreds of millions of people, at which point a very significant investment, for example in rural Afghanistan or Pakistan, in stopping somebody getting polio, you can get quite surprising investments where you could end up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars tracking down the last few cases, if it actually prevents millions of people getting the disease, is critical. In Ebola, the same. The issue raised by the Right Honourable Member from Rhondda around the subject of what we do to deal with fears is central to the very tragic death of a very courageous doctor who has been killed bringing a vaccination and bringing treatment to people in eastern DRC. He came originally from Cameroon. Part of the same story revolves around public health nurses killed on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, trying to inoculate people against polio. In the solution to this, then, is human courage. In the driver of this is human suffering. But in the broader story of this is also things that we have to communicate too. The use of pharmaceutical companies that we're often nervous about can play an incredibly positive role if properly harnessed. So Merck, in this case, which is helping to develop some of this vaccination, has got a structured contract with the Global Alliance to deliver 350,000 vaccinations on hold at any one time. We've reduced the price of vital drugs from $4 to $2, which means that we can access twice as many people. We have worked out how to take the fact that Britain is the global leader in Gavi. Britain puts in 25% of the funds into this extraordinary global program of vaccination. But second is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and third is the government of the United States, all of which makes our money go much further. And tied into it is the World Health Organization. Tied into it is some of the best universities and researchers in the world. So to conclude, in telling the story of immunization, we tell the story of international development. And in telling the story of international development, we are telling the story of international cooperation. The way that researchers from China, Europe, can come together. The way that brave health workers on the ground in eastern DRC can risk their lives delivering these things. The way that that single child in eastern DRC, saved from death, and the horror that that family experiences, is something that you can trace back through money spent by British taxpayers, working alongside people from other countries, bringing in the private sector, bringing in the best academics in the world, and above all, bringing in brutal, bruising practicality. How do you make sure you get the refrigeration right in Eastern DRC so that these vaccines actually survive in transport? How do you get the electricity to make sure the vaccination works? How do you deal with communities and politics and conflicts in order to get to the front line? How do you understand the political economic structures on the ground to make sure that the local, in Afghanistan, the local mullah or the local village chief is not going to block the arrival of the polio in that community? Get all those things right, and you protect Britain from dying from Ebola. Get all those things right in the world of climate change, and we can potentially save the planet. Get all these things right, and we can show how our international aid budget can touch everybody in this country, re-energize a younger generation, and prove that if we can sometimes do less than we hope, we can do much more than we fear. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered